In August of 2018, 31-year-old biologist Leonie Strode set out from Manaus to the Zhao National Park. She was planning a week-long solo expedition to find a rare species of poisonous frog. A camera on the jetty captured her getting into a motorboat, and her handwriting is in the visitor's log. Return on Sunday. The next day, Leonie called her sister from a satellite phone and mentioned strange footprints, as if someone was working on plants with a scalpel in the jungle. After that, the connection was lost. There are few primary sources that allow us to recreate Leonie Strode's last days before her disappearance. The most complete is a travel blog entry published a few days before she disappeared deep in Zhao Park. In this text, she describes her own preparations, the scientific goals of the expedition, and mentions that she had long dreamed of seeing a rare amphibian in nature, which has become almost a professional obsession for her. The post is accompanied by photos, a greenish backpack, an old container for collecting live specimens, sterile test tubes, a set of pocket tools, maps of the route, and the boat that was to take her north to the dark waters of the Rio Negro. In a short video shot on the Lagoon Velho dock, she smiles, adjusts her backpack strap, and says that she has several days of hard work ahead of her, but that the forest, she says, always pays those who can look. Another important piece of evidence is her sister Karen's memories, which she provided to federal police investigators. It is from Karen's words that we know about Leonie's last phone call. It was in the afternoon when the researcher was already far from any settlement. Karen described her sister's voice as tired, but with her characteristic intonations of excitement, which appeared whenever Leonie found something worthy of attention. Her story suggests that Leonie came across traces that she said were too human. These were plants cut with a precision that was unnatural for wildlife. Karen recalled that her sister took it as curiosity rather than danger, saying half-jokingly that there was a kind of forest surgeon in the jungle who worked as well as a knife in a laboratory. She did not have time to give further details. The connection was suddenly cut off, and Leonie, despite the previous agreement, did not get in touch again. For the next few days, Karen tried to explain the silence as a lack of signal or a change in the weather, because Leonie always stuck to the route and knew how to work in difficult conditions. But when the deadline for her return passed and the satellite phone continued to be silent, Karen decided to contact the Brazilian federal police. Their response was cautious. They advised her to wait and explained that communication breakdowns happen all the time in the forest, and they only go to those places to look for missing people when there are good reasons to do so. The grounds appeared a few days later, when no signs of movement or access to civilization were recorded from the researcher. At Karen's request, supported by a diplomatic appeal from the consulate, a small group of IBAMA employees and local guides were assembled in Manaus and agreed to go downstream of the Rio Negro to the Igarape do Pau trailhead. The agency's internal documents stated that the search operation in that part of the forest was difficult due to the dense vegetation, lack of established routes, and almost complete invisibility of human tracks. The guides warned that the movement would slow down to the point where one day's travel would be several hundred meters. Nevertheless, they agreed to lead the group because disappearances in that area had an unofficial reputation for being strange. Even experienced hunters often got lost there, and it was always difficult to find any traces. In the first hours of the expedition, they followed the route that, according to the visitor's log, Leonie had chosen, but found nothing to indicate her presence after the first day of the crossing. The forest was too dense, too noisy, and any small clues quickly disappeared under the cover of leaves and branches. In an internal report, which was preserved in the case file, one of the guides described the situation in the following words: "The jungle here quickly eats everything that a person leaves behind." This opinion began to dominate the assessment of the chances of finding anything. Weather conditions deteriorated on the third day of the search. Light but steady rain made the group move more slowly. Inspecting another section of the forest and recording its coordinates, they found no traces of a campsite, no broken branches, no pieces of clothing or equipment. All the available options that could indicate a possible stop for Leonie were gradually ruled out. In the IBAMA documents, there is a line that points to that moment. The territory is so wide that the probability of finding the missing person after such a long absence is almost zero. Despite this, the search continued. Several other local experts were involved, hoping to understand the nature of the vegetation and where the researcher might have gone. Their attempts also yielded no results. The forest was silent, and every day this silence became more and more eloquent. On the sixth day, the operation was officially expanded to a larger sector, but even then, internal records began to mention that the chances of finding Leonie alive were slim. At the same time, it was the first time that another assumption was made. Perhaps there was someone in the forest whom Leonie herself had mentioned in her call. However, at the time, this was perceived only as a detail that was not crucial. The search continued for several more days, but to no avail. All the evidence gathered indicated that Leonie had either gone too far off the beaten track or had fallen victim to circumstances that left almost no material trace. This conclusion was included in the primary materials of the case, which later became one of the most mysterious in the region. The official materials of the search operation show that after the first weeks of unsuccessful combing of the areas along the Igarape-Dupao Trail, the initiative was taken by local guides alone. Formally, the work was not yet suspended, but the force was gradually reduced, as there was no evidence that Leonie could have lingered in this part of the park. In IBAMA's official records, there is a mention that the guides agreed to inspect several remote areas that are rarely reported but have natural shelters suitable for a temporary stop for a person who has gone off the route. These areas were considered only conditionally promising, but it was there that the group went on the third week of the search. In the morning report from one of the guides, there was a description of a small elevated area near the bed of a seasonal stream. According to him, he noticed a change in the structure of the vegetation. The ferns were not randomly spread out, but to one side, as if someone was carefully cutting off the extra stems. This detail was noted as atypical for these places. The guide decided to explore the area, and it was there, after a few meters of moving up the slope, that he saw a formation that resembled a partially collapsed grotto. The entrance was covered with stones and branches, and in a way that was not typical of a natural collapse. The report contains the phrase, "The stones were piled up not by force, but by hand." Inside the grotto, they found a small space that looked more like a temporary shelter than a place for a traveler to spend the night. The floor was covered with a thin layer of ash. The remains of an old hearth lay near the wall, where, as noted in the report, rough shelves had been hollowed out. On them were a few dried fruits, cracked by time, and fragments of a bamboo container. The appearance of the storage facility did not match the usual campsites of locals, hunters, or illegal poachers. The guides who examined the grotto stated in their testimony that the hand that arranged this place knew the forest, but did not live there permanently. The very first discovery was an empty plastic bottle with a label from one of the European water producers. This brand was not sold in Manuus, but could easily be found in the luggage of travelers arriving via international flights. Investigators later confirmed that these were the bottles Leonie took with her during her expeditions, as she reused them to store solutions after cleaning. There were no clear prints on the bottle, but the coincidence with the things she usually took on her trips was the first hint that the researcher might have stayed here, or at least been nearby. The second piece of evidence was a discovery that later completely changed the course of the investigation. On the floor of the grotto was a crumpled sheet, half spoiled by moisture. It was a fragment of a page from a field diary. Analysis of the paper and waterproof ink confirmed the origin. These were the notebooks Leonie used in her scientific travels. The text on the page was partially reproduced. The upper part contained her usual short notes on the behavior of the Amadorian frog, which she hoped to find in these forests. Then the manuscript became uneven, with several lines containing strokes that looked chaotic, but the confident handwriting returned in the final passage, which read, "He knows this forest better than I do, not a hunter, a botanist, a doctor. His methods are frighteningly precise. He calls himself Sativar." These words became the first documented evidence that there could be another person in the jungle, unknown to the searchers. It is important that Leonie mention this name in the last lines that have survived and described methods that are not typical of either casual travelers or hunters. The fragment itself, according to experts, was torn out of the notebook on purpose, not by accident. Investigators suggested that she might have wanted to hide or take away information that she considered disturbing. Once the page was discovered, the search operation was no longer considered a rescue operation. It became a criminal investigation. Representatives of the federal police who arrived at the grotto documented its condition, took pictures of the internal structure, and noticed that the vault had not been used for a long time. The ashes in the fire pit were old, and the vegetation at the entrance had partially grown back, indicating a lack of recent activity. However, the reports indicate the same feeling as described by the guides. There was a presence in this place, but not a random one. There was a new John Doe, one whom Leonie called Sativar. Internal federal police documents state that this name was the starting point for further action. Investigators began to check possible explanations. He could be an illegal collector of rare plants, a reclusive healer, or a hermit who knew the forest perfectly. They even considered the theory of an experienced scientist who could work autonomously and hide his activities. The discovery in the grotto created a new direction for the investigators. If Leonie had really met someone in the jungle, that person could explain what happened after her disappearance. But the unknown person left no traces, except for those that were already beginning to be absorbed by the forest. The documents state that the guides did not find any prints or markers of the recent presence of another person. Only the structure of the shelter itself indicated that it was not abandoned by a random traveler. All further searches in that part of the park were conducted with a different goal in mind: to find the person Leonie had written about and to find out if he was connected to the researcher's disappearance. The jungle seemed indifferent, but for the first time in the 3 weeks of the operation, it showed signs of someone's quiet, almost imperceptible intervention. It was this sign that became the new center of attention for those trying to understand how a man who knew nature, as well as those who were born there, disappeared in the depths of the Amazon. It has been more than 5 years since the federal police files contained a dry record of Leonie Strode's disappearance deep in Zhao Park. Formally, the investigation remained open, but any activity gradually came to a standstill. The family received the official status of missing, and although Leonie's sister continued to maintain contact with Brazilian investigators, no new leads appeared in the case file. The forest swallowed up everything that could explain her fate. Unofficial sources say that the first people to raise this story again were people who were far from any law. Groups of garimpeiros, illegal gold miners, often entered the territories of abandoned rubber industries. They knew about the existence of a quarry, which the locals called Seringal Abandonado Esperança. Latex used to be harvested here, but a few decades ago, production declined, and the area was left to fend for itself. Prospectors would visit from time to time, looking for ore or scrap metal. According to one of the unnamed informants who later testified to the federal police, it was during one such illegal visit that they came across a narrow pit littered with the debris of old wooden pillars. The entrance was partially blocked, but one of the miners noticed a faint silhouette in the depths, which he first took to be a mannequin or abandoned work clothes. It was only when they got closer that it became clear that these were human remains. The skeleton was lying on its side, wedged between the fragments of a once massive beam and an old rubber barrel. There were scraps of equipment, a belt with a stitched number, fabric loops from a backpack, and a fragment of a khaki jacket. All of these details were too decayed to identify immediately, but the prospectors quickly recalled the news from 5 years ago about the disappearance of a European researcher in these forests. They had no intention of informing the authorities, but something made them change their minds. There was an object on the skull that they described as a mask, but their words did not convey what the photographs showed. The artifact was made of dark, almost black wood, which shone even in the weak light of the lantern. The edges of the mask were inlaid with small, sharp teeth of wild peccary pigs, and dried fragments of poisonous frog skins ran along the central part, retaining some of their natural color. In some places, the texture of the wood was polished so smoothly that it resembled a surgical procedure. The mask fit snugly to the skull, as if it had been put on immediately after death, when the tissues had not yet had time to dry. According to the testimony of the miners, they did not even try to remove it. The appearance of the artifact was so eerie that it caused them a physical sense of threat. Fear, mixed with a desire to receive a reward, forced them to take several photos, after which one of the miners, according to preliminary data, a person who had previously had dealings with the police, passed the pictures to a friend in Manaus. The latter notified the local federal police department, and a team of investigators went to the quarry the next day. Police officers carefully documented the condition of the pit, the location of the remains, and the appearance of the mask. The protocols state that the body had been lying in relatively stable conditions. Cold and humidity slowed down decomposition, allowing the forensic team to conduct analyses with sufficient accuracy. It is because of these conditions that the skull with the mask is so well preserved. The solid wood and animal teeth were not damaged. The initial identification study yielded the first clear conclusion. The remains belonged to a European woman in her 30s who died at least 5 years ago. This was followed by a match in the size of the equipment, genetic testing, and a check with Interpol databases. All the data confirmed that it was Leonie Strode. Special attention was paid to the mask. The ethnobotanists found that the materials used came from different parts of the Amazon, but were selected with precision that required considerable knowledge. The peccary's teeth were carefully polished. The wood was treated to have the smoothness of a laboratory instrument, and the frog skin fragments indicated species that are toxic even after drying. Internal police materials contain a remark that the mask looks not like a tribal artifact, but like the handiwork of a person with special training. The discovery was so unusual that the report was immediately sent to Interpol. According to official data, Leonie's sister Karen learned about it from European contact officers. This was the first time in years that she received confirmation of what had happened to her sister, although the circumstances of her death remained unclear. The documents of the investigation team contain a conclusion that determined the further direction of the investigation. Leonie did not die by accident. The nature of the mask, its tight fit, and the materials used indicated that an unauthorized person had intentionally killed her. And the name, once found in the depths of the vault, took on a new meaning. Sadivar no longer looked like a ghost or an imagination of a frightened traveler. He had become the main suspect in a case that had come to life again after years of silence in the forest. Federal police documents state that the work on Leonie Strode's remains lasted several weeks and included a full cycle of forensic, botanical, and zoological examinations. The laboratory in Manaus was the first to receive the materials. It was from there that the first confirmations came. Bone fragments, dental structures, and tissue remains match samples that had been recovered from Leonie's belongings before her last expedition. DNA analysis, conducted according to international protocol, gave an unequivocal answer. The remains belonged to the German biologist who disappeared in the Amazon jungle several years ago. The cause of death, according to forensic experts, was determined fairly quickly. The report says that she was stabbed in the heart with a narrow blade, almost perfectly aimed. The wound had smooth edges, no tears, and no chaotic damage that would be characteristic of a struggle or panicked attempt at defense. Forensic experts emphasize that the weapon was a special medical instrument, not a hunting knife or a handicraft weapon. There were no signs of torture or prolonged violence on the bones and tissue remains. This indicates a quick death caused by a person who knew exactly how to strike to stop the heartbeat instantly. But the most attention was drawn to the mask found on the skull. All work with it was carried out separately in sterile boxes. At first, experts identified the material, a rare dark wood that grows only in certain parts of the Amazon and is sometimes used in ceremonies of local tribes. However, the structure of the mask did not correspond to tribal traditions. The carving was too precise, the grinding too smooth. Experts suggested the use of professional tools similar to those used in medical or laboratory workshops. The peccary teeth were inlaid with jewelry precision. They were polished in such a way that the edges became smooth, and the surface had a characteristic shine, as if tinted with resin. Particularly noteworthy were the dried fragments of poisonous frog skins. Based on the results of the comparative analysis, the species was identified as the same Amoeba trivitata that Leonie was going to study. The toxins in the residues were active even after years in a humid environment. Experts noted that only a person with a good knowledge of the chemistry of these substances could process and install such a dangerous material without poisoning. The mask consisted of more than 20 separate elements, fitted with almost surgical symmetry. This gave experts reason to believe that its author was not just a master woodworker, but had deep professional training in biology, anatomy, and probably medicine. The inner surface of the mask had no traces of forced fixation, which means that it was put on either at the time of death or immediately after the heart stopped beating. The laboratory's summary report states that the person who created the mask did not belong to a tribe, was not a casual hunter or tourist. The person had knowledge beyond everyday skills. In the investigator's notes, the wording appears, "a master who works in her own system." Such a combination of botanical, zoological, and medical skills could only belong to a specialist who had access to special techniques and had been engaged in research for many years. The same collection of documents contains another important idea. The mask was symbolic in nature. Investigators assumed that the killer knew about Leonie's work, perhaps even followed her research, and decided to use it against her. The mask became not just a tool of posthumous fixation, but an act of demonstrative control, turning the victim into an artifact. It looks like a signature left on purpose. All of this made it possible to form the first clear profile of the man whom Leonie called Sadivar. He was described not as a crazy traveler, but as an artisan with a scientific discipline, a collector who works according to a logic that only he understands. These conclusions became the basis for the next stage of the investigation, when investigators began to review archives on people with medical or biological education who lived or worked in remote areas of the Amazon. The federal police file records that after establishing the profile of the possible killer, investigators turned to historical materials about medical missions that operated along the upper reaches of the Rio Negro. It was there, in a small archive room at a former clinic in São Gabriel de Cachoeira, that the case of Dr. Alvaro Zapatera's disappearance was kept. This became one of the first areas of investigation because his professional career, as described in the documents, had strange resonances with what the experts found in the manufacture of the mask. The archival reports show that Dr. Zapatera had been working in the humanitarian mission for more than a few years. He was a highly skilled surgeon with an impeccable reputation in Europe, but while working in the Amazon, he began to use treatment methods that the administration considered unacceptable. He turned to local plants, tested them as part of his therapy, and insisted that traditional medicine ignored the opportunities offered by the jungle biome. His official documents contain remarks about his radical approach. Conflicts with his superiors escalated, and then, according to reports, he disappeared while traveling to a remote village. His body was never found. The official conclusion was that it was an accident or an attack by wild animals. In parallel, investigators conducted unofficial interviews with residents of villages located between São Gabriel de Cachoeira and the upper reaches of the Rio Negro. The same motifs were repeated in these testimonies. People spoke of a figure called Dom Sadivar, Mr. Gardner. He was described as a silent shadow that appeared near places where medicinal plants or poisonous species that had disappeared from other parts of the forest grew. Some mentioned that he does not harm his own, but avoids outsiders. Some believed him to be the spirit of the forest, while others thought he was a former scientist who had lost his mind. What these stories had in common was the certainty that this man had been around for a long time, much longer than the missions had been officially active. A review of Interpol's digital databases yielded a new clue. Among the materials about Dr. Alvaro, they found a photo taken before he left for the Amazon. In the picture, he was standing next to his younger brother, Emilio Zapatera, a biology specialist. The short accompanying description mentioned that Emilio had worked in several research projects, also in the Rio Negro region. His name later appeared in a completely different file as the victim of a laboratory fire. but the body was not identified. The document spoke of complete tissue destruction. As a result, a hypothesis emerged that changed the nature of the investigation. If Emilio's death was not confirmed and Alvaro's disappearance remained unexplained, then Sadivar could be one of the brothers, or even a person who used their identities, knowledge, and professional legacy. Investigators noted that the profile of a master physician capable of working with botanical toxins and anatomical precision coincided with the training of both Zapaters. And it was this line that began to be seen as key in the search for a person who could live in the shadows of the jungle for years, unnoticed by the outside world. Federal police official documents state that after studying archives and testimonies about the Zapatera brothers, the investigation changed direction and focused on places where they could have worked or left traces of their activities. One of these sites was the abandoned Amazon Biosphere Station, located deep in the forest in an area that was officially considered mothballed. According to old records, it was there that Emilio Zapatera worked before the tragedy that allegedly took his life. The group of investigators, accompanied by local guides, reached the station after several days of walking. From the outside, the building resembled the remains of a science center, a collapsed roof, sprouting window frames, and empty equipment containers. But inside, despite the decay, there was a sense of orderliness, as if someone had left the premises not in panic, but with cold prudence. It was in this space that the investigators came across the first hiding place. The herbarium, which was supposed to contain plant specimens, was filled with photographs. All the photos were neatly pasted into transparent bags, labeled and arranged by date. They showed fragments of trails, rare plant species, traces of deforestation, and people who were photographed from a distance, travelers, ecologists, researchers. Among them was a clear picture of Leonie Strode. According to an expert opinion, it was taken a few days before her disappearance, probably with a long lens. This was the first indisputable proof that Emilio had been following her, and therefore knew about her route and the purpose of the expedition. An even more significant discovery was a laboratory journal hidden in a tin container under the floor. Most of the entries were about botanical experiments, toxicity, adaptation, artificial microbiomes. But between the lines of scientific terminology, there was a change in tone. In some parts of the text, there was an obsession with the perfection of the ecosystem, which the author viewed as a single organism in need of surgical intervention. He wrote about parasitic species, destructive factors, and wrong aliens. In several passages, the author emphasized that only targeted removal could restore the forest to balance. One section was about his brother. It stated, "Alvaro tried to heal individual wounds. This is pointless. It makes no sense to treat a person if the whole system is sick. I work with the root of the problem. I remove the weak links." The entry was made with a confident hand, without any signs of emotion, rather as a statement of his own doctrine. This journal became the main evidence that the profile of the killer matched the personality of Emilio Zapatera. Investigators noted that his idea of cleaning up the ecosystem was consistent with the manufacture of masks, turning victims into part of the very environment he considered a living structure. Such actions cannot be attributed to a random person. The author of the diary thought as a biologist, as a craftsman, and as a fanatic who consciously created symbols of his own understanding of nature. The profiling team's conclusion states that Emilio did not act chaotically. He chose those who, in his opinion, posed a threat to the forest. Leonie, who planned to collect and transport rare species, fell into this category. That is why her transformation into an artifact became an act of restoring balance for him in his own distorted coordinate system. After analyzing all the materials found, the federal police officially put Emilio Zapatera on the international wanted list. The documents contained a description: a person with a high level of training, able to live autonomously in the jungle for decades, using natural resources and avoiding any traces. This is exactly how local legends described the invisible Sativar, the Mr. Gardener who appears only where the forest requires his intervention. The problem remained the same. All traces led to a man who had existed outside of society for so long that he had become the jungle's own self-regulating mechanism. Finding someone who knew the forest better than any guide meant entering his territory, where he determined the rules and boundaries himself. Federal police summary documents state that after Sativar's identity was established, the investigation faced an obvious problem. Emilio Zapatera could live in the forest as long as he wanted, but complete autonomy was impossible even for a person with his knowledge. All the analytical groups came to a common conclusion. He had to go out to civilization from time to buy medicines, antiseptics, tools, or exchange forest resources for food. These rare exits were the only chance to find him. They started checking small towns along the Nightingale and Rio Negro rivers. Kawari was mentioned infrequently. It was not a major transportation hub, but it had a market where people from remote areas came to visit. It was there that the investigators drew attention to the private clinic Santa Elena, which formerly served residents of the city and several surrounding villages. According to procurement reports, the clinic regularly received surgical instruments and medicines that exceeded its needs. The owner, an elderly doctor, explained this as charitable support for isolated communities, but his words were not documented. An undercover agent was sent to Kawari to check it out. According to his report, he entered the clinic posing as a traveler in need of a bandage. While the doctor was looking for bandages, a man appeared in the waiting room. The agent described him as calm, cleanly dressed, and unremarkable at first glance. But his hands gave away the rest, clean to the point of sterility, with the skin cut off on the fingertips, which is typical of those who work with small instruments all the time. This man was buying antiseptics and silk material while keeping quiet, not making eye contact, and avoiding any conversation. It was this behavior that caught the agent's attention. After a short, unsuccessful attempt to start a neutral conversation, the agent decided to follow the stranger. According to him, the man did not go to the river, did not go to the forest, and did not use public transportation. He walked confidently, as if he knew the city well, and in a few minutes he reached a house on the outskirts. According to the documentation, the house belonged to a doctor from Santa Elena. Further checking confirmed an important detail. The doctor and Emilio Zapatera had once worked together in a medical mission. The doctor disappeared from official structures after a conflict within the organization, and his name and photo were repeatedly mentioned in old reports. In an internal memo, investigators speculated that the doctor knew Emilio and could have been helping him for years, convinced that he needed support or feeling guilty about past events. After confirming this connection, the house was placed under discreet surveillance. Over the next few hours, only one visitor was recorded, the same man from the clinic. Only then was it decided to storm the house. The unit entered the house through two entrances simultaneously, and, as stated in the report, there was no resistance. Emilio Zapatera was found in the kitchen. He was sitting at the table, leaning over a herbarium. In front of him was a neatly arranged set of plants, some of which the police later identified as toxic. On the table was a container with dry samples of wood similar to the one used to make the mask found on Leonie's remains. According to the agents, he looked neither surprised nor frightened. He raised his head, looked calmly at the men in bulletproof vests, and said a few words recorded in the report. He did not consider himself a criminal and described his occupation as caring for the forest, removing weeds, and restoring order. The doctor was taken in for questioning the same day. He said that Emilio visited him irregularly, sometimes every few months, sometimes once a year. He paid not with money, but with rare herbs that were banned for commercial use. The doctor did not ask him where he lived or what he was doing, explaining that he thought he was a man who had been through too much. After Zapatera's detention, investigators recorded that his behavior was even, devoid of aggression and remorse. He was in a state of what experts called detached confidence. All the physical evidence in the house confirmed his systematic interference with natural processes and his connection to Leonie's disappearance. The figure who had been considered a legend, a shadow, or a warning for years turned out to be a man who lived quietly on the outskirts of a small town, regularly buying tools for his secret work in the heart of the Amazon. The materials of the trial of Emilio Zapatera preserved almost the entire course of the proceedings: stenographic records, expert opinions, internal correspondence between prosecutors and the Psychiatric Commission. The overall picture is clear. The accused did not deny anything he was charged with, but did not plead guilty in a legal or moral sense. On the first day of the hearing, he behaved calmly, kept his hands in his lap, looked in front of him, and answered, only when asked directly. The protocol states that he spoke in a steady voice and used terms that would have been more appropriate for a presentation at a scientific conference than for testifying. He spoke of actions that the investigation regarded as premeditated murders as interference, removal, and correction of the environment. When the prosecutor asked to clarify the word removed, Zapatera explained that it was not about violence against a person, but about stopping destructive interaction with the ecosystem. He called Leonie an uncontrollable factor that threatened the integrity of the structure. According to the investigator, Zapatera never used the term victim. One part of the interrogation concerned his motives. Forensic experts note that his explanations were both clear and devoid of emotion. He argued that the Amazon is a closed system capable of self-regulation, but that human interference upsets the balance. He viewed those who had an impact on this balance as anomalous elements. His task, according to his own definition, was to ensure the natural state of the system, avoiding unnecessary pain, because a painful process is a wrong process. The masks he made were seen by him as the aesthetic completion of a function, the return of the body to structure. The commission's experts drew attention to the fact that Zapatera spoke about this without aggression and without signs of guilt. The defense materials contain a statement that Zapatera did not deny the facts of the case, but insisted that he acted in accordance with the logic of nature. It was this, not the intention to conceal the crime, that became the key to the psychiatrist's conclusions. The commission emphasized that he did not perceive his actions as illegal. On the contrary, he considered them necessary, a kind of duty. The conclusion states that his thinking was shaped by prolonged isolation, the loss of his brother, and the gradual transformation of his scientific work into a system of fanatical beliefs. He identified himself with the ecosystem in which he lived and stopped separating his own decisions from the laws of nature that he invented. A forensic psychiatric examination declared Emilio Zapatera insane. He could not be considered to be aware of the nature of his actions in a social or legal sense. The court ordered him to be sent to a closed psychiatric hospital where he was to undergo long-term therapy under supervision. The court's decision contained a note. The person poses a danger not because of impulsiveness, but because of convictions. It was this characterization that made the prospect of his release virtually impossible. Information about his first days in the hospital comes from internal staff reports. According to the nurses, he did not show aggression, did not resist during the procedures, but almost never interacted with the doctors. He did only one thing. He set up a small space on the windowsill of the ward, where he transferred pots of plants allowed in the hospital. On several occasions, he was caught trying to germinate seeds, probably brought in his clothes during his detention. The report states, "The patient takes care of the plants with excessive meticulousness, pays more attention to them than to people." The staff forbade bringing any natural substrates into his ward, but he continued to build his garden using the humidity of the air and even parts of fabric from which he made improvised substrates. The final part of the official chronicle comes from the testimony of Leonie's sister, Karen, who requested to visit the institution. She was allowed into the observation room, where conversations were conducted only through a protective glass. According to her, Zapatera was sitting on the floor, bent over his plants, and did not react to her appearance. He acted as if no one on the other side of the glass existed. Karen described it this way: he was completely inside his forest, as if the hospital room was an extension of the jungle that had engulfed him. The case file does not contain her direct emotional assessments, only a short statement. But according to the investigators who worked with her, it was the first time Karen saw a person whose presence explained a lot but did not answer the main question. This moment is recorded in the final report. The case is considered closed, but the internal echo of the tragedy remains as deafening as the silence of the Amazon forest that once hid Sadivar's first traces.